The story begins with Reverend Marcus Whitfield, a traveling minister whose circuit included the most remote settlements in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. His journal, discovered in 1962 during the demolition of an abandoned church, contains accounts that scholars have struggled to categorize. Whitfield's entries from the winter of 1769 describe encounters that sound more like fever dreams than historical record, yet the detail and consistency of his observations suggest something far more disturbing than simple delusion. Whitfield first learned of the Hartwell family from Samuel Pierce, a fur trader whose roots took him through the most isolated valleys of Appalachian Virginia. Pierce's account, filed with colonial authorities in Williamsburg, describes a family living in what he called defiance of both God and nature, in a hollow so remote that it appeared on no maps and could be reached only by following deer paths that seemed to shift and change between visits.
Tell us from where are you watching this video by writing in the comments so that we can know how far our videos are reaching, and do subscribe so that you keep getting regular thrilling stories that are to come next.
The Hartwells, according to Pierce's testimony, had originally been part of a larger settlement that had pushed into the mountains in the 1740s, seeking fertile land and freedom from the increasingly crowded eastern counties. But where other families had eventually established connections with neighboring communities or moved on to more hospitable territory, the Hartwells had simply adapted. Pierce described his first encounter with the family in terms that would have been dismissed as frontier folklore, if not for the chilling specificity of his observations. He had been following what appeared to be a promising trade route when he came upon their settlement, a collection of structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, as though the buildings had been cultivated rather than constructed. The family, he reported, consisted of Silas Hartwell, his wife Constance, and their 9 children. But Pierce noted immediately that something was fundamentally wrong with their appearances and behavior. The children moved with an uncanny synchronization, as though they shared a single nervous system. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, casting beams that seemed to have physical substance, creating visible paths through the air that intersected in patterns that hurt to contemplate. Most disturbing of all was their apparent prosperity. Despite claiming to have endured a harsh winter that had supposedly devastated their crops and livestock, the Hartwells appeared remarkably well-nourished. Their stores were filled with preserved meat of unusual texture and coloration, and they spoke of new hunting methods that had proven remarkably effective. When Pierce inquired about these methods, hoping to learn techniques that might benefit his own wilderness survival, the family's response was unsettling. Silas Hartwell's smile grew too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp for a human mouth. The children began laughing in perfect unison, not the natural laughter of youngsters at play, but something older, hungrier, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Pierce's bones. "We've learned to make the most of what the Lord provides," Constance Hartwell explained, her voice joining the strange harmonic chorus created by her family. "Every traveler who passes through these mountains brings opportunities. Some folks just don't know how to appreciate them properly." That evening, Pierce witnessed something that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Unable to sleep in the oppressive atmosphere of the Hartwell homestead, he ventured outside for fresh air. In the moonlight, he observed the family engaged in what appeared to be some form of ritual gathering. All 11 members of the Hartwell clan had assembled in a perfect circle in their yard. They swayed in unison, chanting in a language that seemed to predate human speech, their pale eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. But most disturbing of all were the objects scattered around their ritual circle, human bones that had been scraped clean and polished to a high shine, arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. Pierce fled that very night, traveling through treacherous mountain terrain in complete darkness rather than spending another hour in that cursed hollow. His sworn testimony, initially dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation, prompted an investigation that would uncover one of the most disturbing chapters in colonial American history. The investigation was led by Captain Jonas Prescott of the Virginia Colonial Militia, who assembled a party of 15 armed men to verify Pierce's claims and determine the fate of other travelers who had reportedly vanished in the region. Prescott's detailed report, preserved in the Virginia State Archives, provides the most comprehensive account of what they discovered in that remote hollow. The expedition arrived at the Hartwell settlement on November 3, 1769, to find a location that seemed to exist in violation of basic principles of geography and physics. The buildings appeared solid from a distance, but as the men approached, they realized the structures defied conventional architecture. Walls curved in ways that created optical illusions. Windows reflected impossible angles, and smoke from chimneys formed patterns in the air that lingered far longer than natural combustion should allow. Captain Prescott noted that his surveying instruments produced contradictory readings when used within the settlement boundaries. Compasses spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Timepieces either stopped entirely or began running at different speeds, making it impossible to determine how long they had been on the property. Most unsettling of all, the men found themselves becoming disoriented despite the relatively small size of the settlement. They would walk toward a building only to find themselves approaching from a different direction, or attempt to leave the area only to discover they had somehow circled back to where they started. When the Hartwell family emerged to greet the expedition, Prescott's men found themselves face to face with something that challenged their understanding of human nature. The family members had undergone transformations that went far beyond simple physical adaptation to harsh living conditions. Silas Hartwell, who had been described by earlier witnesses as a reasonably normal frontier patriarch, now appeared gaunt to the point of emaciation, yet moved with a strength and coordination that suggested enhanced rather than diminished physical capabilities. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath. But the vascular system was wrong, too complex, too interconnected, as though his circulatory system had been redesigned for purposes that transcended normal biological function. Constance Hartwell and the children showed similar alterations. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, creating living geometric patterns as they went about their daily activities. Their eyes had developed an inner luminescence that cast light in directions that defied the laws of physics, and their voices had taken on harmonic qualities that seemed to bypass normal hearing and speak directly to something deeper in the observer's consciousness. Most disturbing of all was their apparent relationship with time itself. The family members seemed to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, occasionally making references to events that hadn't yet occurred or responding to questions before they were asked. They moved through their daily routines with a purpose and efficiency that suggested they were following a script written by some intelligence far removed from ordinary human concerns. Captain Prescott's men discovered evidence of the family's true nature in a series of underground chambers that extended far beneath the settlement. These spaces, which seemed to follow geometric rather than geological principles, contained what could only be described as a cultivation system, a network of chambers where human remains were being processed and transformed into something else entirely. The preserved forms suspended throughout these chambers were still alive, still conscious, but they had been changed into something that existed in a state between individual identity and collective absorption. Their faces showed not agony, but a kind of transcendent peace, as though they had discovered a form of existence that exceeded anything their previous human lives had offered them. Prescott's report describes in clinical detail how the Hartwell family moved through this underground garden with the familiarity of long practice, tending to their crop with the same care that other farmers might show toward grain or vegetables. They harvested portions of the suspended forms with surgical precision, the victims showing no signs of distress. Instead, they seemed to welcome the harvesting as though it represented some form of communion or spiritual completion. The expedition retreated without confronting the family directly, but not before witnessing what Prescott described as their evening communion. As the sun set, all 11 members of the Hartwell clan gathered in the center of their settlement and began a transformation that challenged the sanity of every man present. Their bodies began to change, elongating and reshaping in ways that suggested they were not bound by conventional anatomical limitations. Their skin became increasingly translucent, revealing internal structures that had been fundamentally redesigned. Their eyes grew larger and brighter, casting beams of light that seemed to reach into dimensions beyond normal perception. And then something joined them. A presence that Prescott could only describe as both singular and multiple. Something that existed in the spaces between the family members while simultaneously being part of each of them. It communicated not through words, but through direct transmission of concepts and emotions that left the watching soldiers feeling simultaneously enlightened and contaminated. Prescott's men fled immediately, but found themselves pursued for days by the sound of synchronized footsteps and that strange harmonic singing echoing off the mountain walls. It was only when they reached a major settlement that the pursuit finally ceased. The captain's official report recommended that the area be declared off-limits to all civilian travel, and that a permanent military presence be established to prevent further incidents. However, the colonial authorities, unwilling to commit resources to what many considered an exaggerated frontier tale, classified the documents and took no further action. But the story didn't end with Prescott's retreat. Over the following decades, reports began to surface from throughout the Appalachian region, describing encounters with families that shared the Hartwells' disturbing characteristics. These accounts came from traders, settlers, and even other military expeditions, all describing pale-eyed clans living in impossible isolation, always prosperous despite apparent hardships, always interested in helping travelers who passed through their territory. The pattern that emerged suggested something far more organized than a single family's descent into madness. These related clans seemed to be spreading their influence systematically throughout the mountain regions, establishing themselves in locations that provided access to major travel routes, while remaining hidden from official notice. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Dr. Nathaniel Brooks, a physician who encountered what he believed to be a Hartwell settlement while traveling through eastern Tennessee in 1783. Dr. Brooks, trained in the latest medical techniques and committed to scientific observation, initially approached the family as a researcher interested in studying what he assumed were symptoms of extreme isolation and inbreeding. His examination of the family members revealed anatomical impossibilities that challenged his understanding of human physiology. The children possessed dental structures that were continuously regenerating, with new teeth emerging behind existing ones in multiple rows. Their jaws had elongated to accommodate this growth, giving their faces an almost predatory quality. Most remarkably, Dr. Brooks observed what appeared to be a shared nervous system among the family members. When he conducted standard medical tests on one child, all the others reacted simultaneously, displaying identical responses to stimuli they shouldn't have been able to perceive. They seemed to experience sensation, emotion, and even consciousness as a collective entity rather than as individuals. Dr. Brooks's private journal, discovered in 1923 and held by the Tennessee Historical Society, contains his most disturbing observations about the family's relationship with their guests. He witnessed them feeding a sick traveler a broth made from their mysterious meat stores, and documented the rapid transformation that followed. Within hours, the traveler's appearance began to match that of the family: pale skin, luminous eyes, and synchronized movements. More disturbing still, the individual's personality seemed to merge with the collective consciousness of the clan. He began speaking in their harmonic voices and demonstrated knowledge he couldn't have possessed, details about distant places he had never visited, and people he had never met. Dr. Brooks fled before the transformation was complete, but his journal records his conviction that he had witnessed some form of intentional infection or conversion. The family, he believed, wasn't simply consuming human flesh for sustenance. They were using it as a vector for spreading their condition to carefully selected victims. The most comprehensive account of the Hartwell phenomenon comes from Stone Wolf, a Cherokee elder whose tribal territory bordered the regions where these families had been established. Stone Wolf's testimony, recorded by missionary Henry Clayton in 1791, provides crucial insight into the true nature of what the Hartwells had become. According to Cherokee oral tradition, the mountain regions where these families lived had long been considered spiritually dangerous, places where the natural order had been disrupted by human actions that exceeded acceptable boundaries. The Cherokee had specific warnings about certain valleys and hollows, passed down through generations, describing locations where the earth dreams wrong dreams, and where contact with certain entities could fundamentally alter human nature. Stone Wolf's account describes the Hartwells not as victims of circumstance or madness, but as willing participants in a transformation that had been offered to them by something that existed beyond normal human understanding. They had been given a choice: continue struggling with the harsh realities of frontier life, or accept a different kind of existence altogether, one that transcended the limitations of individual mortality, but required surrendering everything they had been before. The Cherokee elder's description of the entity that had made this offer is frustratingly vague, possibly because human language lacks the vocabulary to describe something that exists outside normal categories of understanding. Stone Wolf spoke of a hunger that teaches, something that had learned to sustain itself not through conventional predation, but through a process that was somehow both more intimate and more complete than anything natural predators could achieve. This entity, according to Stone Wolf, had been present in the mountains for far longer than any human settlement. It had waited patiently for the right conditions: isolated communities, desperate circumstances, individuals willing to consider alternatives to conventional human existence. The Hartwells had simply been the first to accept its bargain. The Cherokee warnings proved prophetic. By 1795, reports of Hartwell-related encounters had spread throughout Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Western Carolinas. Each incident followed the same general pattern. A family would appear in a remote location, establish themselves on the outskirts of existing settlements, and begin demonstrating an unusual interest in travelers who passed through the area. These families shared certain unmistakable characteristics: synchronized movements, luminous eyes, and an unsettling prosperity despite apparent isolation. They were always helpful, always generous with their mysteriously abundant food supplies, and always eager to offer shelter to those traveling alone. But inevitably, people would begin to disappear. Sometimes it was obvious: travelers who simply vanished without a trace. Other times it was more subtle. Individuals who returned from encounters with these families somehow changed, moving with the same eerie coordination, speaking in the same harmonic voices, displaying the same unnaturally keen interest in the movements and plans of other community members. The pattern suggested something far more sophisticated than random acts of cannibalism. These families seemed to be using a carefully planned selection process, choosing victims based on criteria that remained mysterious to outside observers. Some visitors were immediately consumed, but others were deliberately spared and allowed to leave, often with disturbing messages to spread throughout the wider community. Those chosen to survive often found themselves compelled to share their experiences in specific ways, describing their encounters in terms that seemed designed to generate fear, fascination, and most importantly, additional visitors to these remote settlements. It was as though the very act of surviving an encounter carried with it an obligation to serve as an unwitting herald, spreading knowledge of the family's existence in ways that served their larger purposes. The most detailed modern investigation of the Hartwell phenomenon was conducted by William Ashton, a photographer and amateur historian who became obsessed with documenting what he believed to be evidence of their continued existence. In 1889, Ashton organized an expedition to locate and photograph the original Hartwell settlement, using geographical data compiled from various historical accounts. What Ashton discovered in that remote Virginia hollow challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality itself. The settlement was still there, but it existed in a state that defied conventional understanding. The buildings were simultaneously present and absent, visible in photographs but not to the naked eye, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions, occupying space that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's position. The Cherokee elder's description of the entity that had made this offer is frustratingly vague, possibly because human language lacks the vocabulary to describe something that exists outside normal categories of understanding. Stonewolf spoke of a hunger that teaches, something that had learned to sustain itself not through conventional predation, but through a process that was somehow both more intimate and more complete than anything natural predators could achieve. This entity, according to Stonewolf, had been present in the mountains for far longer than any human settlement. It had waited patiently for the right conditions, isolated communities, desperate circumstances, individuals willing to consider alternatives to conventional human existence. The Hartwells had simply been the first to accept its bargain. The Cherokee warnings proved prophetic. By 1795, reports of Hartwell-related encounters had spread throughout Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Western Carolinas. Each incident followed the same general pattern. A family would appear in a remote location, establish themselves on the outskirts of existing settlements, and begin demonstrating an unusual interest in travelers who passed through the area. These families shared certain unmistakable characteristics: synchronized movements, luminous eyes, and an unsettling prosperity despite apparent isolation. They were always helpful, always generous with their mysteriously abundant food supplies, and always eager to offer shelter to those traveling alone. But inevitably, people would begin to disappear. Sometimes it was obvious, travelers who simply vanished without a trace. Other times it was more subtle. Individuals who returned from encounters with these families somehow changed, moving with the same eerie coordination, speaking in the same harmonic voices, displaying the same unnaturally keen interest in the movements and plans of other community members. The pattern suggested something far more sophisticated than random acts of cannibalism. These families seemed to be using a carefully planned selection process, choosing victims based on criteria that remained mysterious to outside observers. Some visitors were immediately consumed, but others were deliberately spared and allowed to leave, often with disturbing messages to spread throughout the wider community. Those chosen to survive often found themselves compelled to share their experiences in specific ways, describing their encounters in terms that seemed designed to generate fear, fascination, and most importantly, additional visitors to these remote settlements. It was as though the very act of surviving an encounter carried with it an obligation to serve as an unwitting herald, spreading knowledge of the family's existence in ways that served their larger purposes. The most detailed modern investigation of the Hartwell phenomenon was conducted by William Ashton, a photographer and amateur historian who became obsessed with documenting what he believed to be evidence of their continued existence. In 1889, Ashton organized an expedition to locate and photograph the original Hartwell settlement, using geographical data compiled from various historical accounts. What Ashton discovered in that remote Virginia hollow challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality itself. The settlement was still there, but it existed in a state that defied conventional understanding. The buildings were simultaneously present and absent, visible in photographs but not to the naked eye, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions, occupying space that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's position. In 1924, a team of anthropologists from the University of Virginia attempted to document the folklore surrounding the Hartwell family, hoping to trace the evolution of the legend and identify its origins in historical fact. What they discovered was a pattern of accounts that stretched back over 150 years, all describing encounters with families that shared identical characteristics despite being separated by decades and hundreds of miles. The consistency of these reports was troubling enough, but even more disturbing was the discovery that many of the witnesses had never been in contact with each other. Isolated mountain communities that had no communication with the outside world had independently developed identical stories about pale-eyed families who offered a terrible form of salvation to those desperate enough to accept it. The anthropological team's report, classified and filed away by university administrators who deemed it unsuitable for academic publication, concluded that the Hartwell legend represented something far more complex than simple folklore. The evidence suggested either an elaborate hoax spanning multiple generations and geographical regions, or something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. Most disturbing of all was the team's discovery that several of their own research subjects had disappeared during the course of the investigation. Local residents who had agreed to be interviewed about their knowledge of the Hartwell phenomenon simply vanished, leaving behind no trace of where they had gone or why they had left. In each case, the missing individuals had last been seen traveling toward the remote mountain regions where the original encounters had supposedly taken place. The anthropological team's final report contained a recommendation that further research into the Hartwell phenomenon be discontinued. The lead researcher, Dr. Margaret Thornbury, wrote that continued investigation posed risks to researchers that exceed acceptable academic parameters. She recommended that the collected materials be sealed and that no further attempts be made to contact individuals claiming knowledge of the families in question. Dr. Thornbury's private letters, discovered after her death in 1956, reveal the true reason for her recommendation. During the course of their research, she and her team had begun experiencing what she described as involuntary, sympathetic responses to the accounts they were documenting. They found themselves moving in unconscious synchronization with each other, completing each other's sentences, and experiencing dreams that seemed to be shared among all team members. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Thornbury reported that she had begun to feel what she called the pull, an overwhelming desire to travel to the remote mountain regions where the encounters had taken place, to seek out the families described in their research, and offer herself as a candidate for whatever transformation they represented. "I understand now," she wrote in her final letter, "why so many investigators have chosen to abandon their research and disappear into those mountains. The knowledge itself is transformative. Once you truly comprehend what the Hartwell families represent, it becomes impossible to remain satisfied with ordinary human existence. They offer something that we didn't even know we were missing." Modern investigations have revealed additional disturbing details about the Hartwell phenomenon. In 1978, a team of geologists studying earthquake activity in the Virginia mountains discovered underground chamber systems that shouldn't exist according to conventional geology. These spaces appear to extend for miles beneath the regions where Hartwell encounters have been reported, forming complex networks that follow geometric rather than natural patterns. Attempts to map these chambers have been frustrated by equipment failures and spatial anomalies that make accurate measurement impossible. Surveying instruments produce readings that contradict each other, suggesting that the underground spaces exist in a state of constant flux. Some chambers appear to be larger when measured from inside than from outside, while others seem to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Recent satellite imagery of the regions in question shows occasional anomalies, areas where the terrain appears different from multiple perspectives, locations that GPS systems have difficulty pinpointing with accuracy, and temperature variations that suggest underground activity that has no known geological explanation. Most disturbing of all are the reports from modern hikers and campers who claim to have encountered what they believe to be descendants of the original Hartwell families. These accounts describe the same pale eyes, synchronized movements, and unsettling hospitality that characterized the historical reports. But they also suggest that whatever the Hartwells became has continued to evolve and adapt to contemporary conditions. Modern witnesses describe encountering pale-eyed individuals in locations far from the original Appalachian settlements, rest stops on lonely highways, isolated gas stations, small towns that seem to exist slightly outside normal geographical boundaries. These individuals often work in positions that provide access to vulnerable populations or that allow them to monitor the movements of travelers passing through their territory. The coordination between these widely separated individuals remains as mysterious as it was in colonial times. Witnesses describe meeting different pale-eyed people who seem to share memories and knowledge, who can anticipate each other's words and actions despite claiming to be strangers, and who demonstrate an unsettling awareness of visitors' personal histories and travel plans. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports suggesting that the selection process noted by historical witnesses has become more sophisticated. Modern survivors describe being subjected to what they call evaluation conversations, lengthy discussions that seem designed to determine not just their immediate vulnerability, but their potential usefulness as unwitting agents for spreading knowledge of the phenomenon. Those who are chosen to survive often find themselves compelled to share their experiences in specific ways, posting detailed accounts online, discussing their encounters with friends and family, and visiting other locations where similar encounters have been reported. It's as though the very act of surviving an encounter carries with it an obligation to serve as an unwitting herald, spreading the story in ways that might serve the larger purposes of whatever the Hartwell families have become. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question that has haunted researchers for generations. Why do we tell these stories? Why do accounts of the Hartwell phenomenon continue to surface, continue to be documented, continue to be shared, despite their disturbing implications? Every witness account we've examined ends the same way. The observers escape, but they are deliberately allowed to escape. They are chosen to spread the story, to plant seeds of fascination and fear in the minds of others. They become unwitting recruiters for entities that feed not just on human flesh, but on human curiosity and the deep, often unacknowledged hunger for experiences that transcend the limitations of ordinary existence. The historical record offers no definitive answers, only questions that seem designed to multiply rather than resolve. The truth about the Hartwell families, if there ever was a single truth, has been buried under centuries of official denial, scholarly dismissal, and the natural human tendency to categorize disturbing accounts as folklore rather than fact. But the questions remain. In the remote places of America, in the rest stops and back roads and forgotten settlements where people disappear without anyone noticing, are they still out there? still coordinating, still choosing who to transform and who to send away as messengers? And if they are, if some aspect of that colonial horror has survived and adapted and spread, then what does it mean that you're hearing this story now? What does it mean that you've been chosen to carry this knowledge forward? Late at night, when you're traveling alone through empty countryside, when you see lights in the distance that might indicate a welcoming homestead or an isolated business, will you remember this account? Will you think twice about accepting help from pale-eyed strangers who seem a little too eager to offer food and shelter? And if you do encounter them, if you find yourself face to face with something that looks human, but moves with inhuman coordination, that speaks with voices that harmonize too perfectly to be natural, will you be one of the chosen few who escapes to tell the tale? Or will you discover what William Ashton, Dr. Margaret Thornberry, and countless others learned? That some experiences are more transformative than we can imagine, that some forms of knowledge fundamentally alter the person who possesses them, making it impossible to return to the blissful ignorance of ordinary human existence? The choice, as it has always been, is yours to make. But remember, they're still out there, somewhere in the hungry places of America, still watching, still waiting, still choosing, and they're always interested in meeting new people. Have you heard of this before? Would you have chosen differently?